Hi, I'm Ireland. I'm a postbac project manager at the Pearl at USC under Dr. Eric Peterson. I'm going to share some exploratory research on food restriction on days that college students use alcohol and or cannabis. My co-authors and I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I'm going to begin with a very brief review of food restriction and substance use behavior among college students. Let's see if I can get this animation to work. So first, alcohol and cannabis are the most commonly used substances among college students, with a national past year use prevalence of about 81% and 41% for alcohol and cannabis, respectively. Intentional restriction of food, fat, or calories on days students use alcohol is also common. Samples of US college students have indicated a past 3-month prevalence of this behavior as high as 55%. Food restriction on alcohol use days is associated with greater risk for alcohol. Food restriction on alcohol use days is associated with greater risk for alcohol use consequences than alcohol use alone. For example, physical altercations, being injured, and sexual violence victimization. And despite the fact that food restriction on alcohol use days is associated with greater substance use consequences, food restriction on days that students use other substances, for example, cannabis, is relatively unexplored. And we think that people may be inclined to restrict food on days they use cannabis because one of the most commonly endorsed motivations for food restriction on alcohol use days is compensating for the extra calories that you're consuming when you're using alcohol. And we anticipate that some people may want to compensate for the calories they expect to consume if they tend to experience post-cannabis use hunger or the munchies. And so with this sample, we wanted to do a few things. First, we wanted to see if we would find similar results to prior food restriction and alcohol use research. That is, do individuals who restrict food on alcohol use days tend to exhibit more alcohol use consequences than those who do not restrict food? Second, we wanted to see if food restriction on cannabis use days was associated with cannabis use consequences, and if so, which ones? Our total sample was composed of 901 college students from a subject pool convenience sample from Colorado. Our analytic sample, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in just a moment, was composed of students who used alcohol and cannabis in the past year and or month, and we asked them if they restricted food on substance use days within that time frame. We ran mean comparisons of alcohol and cannabis use disorder symptom and consequence sum scores between past year and or month users of alcohol and cannabis, between those who did versus did not restrict food on a substance use day. We also ran chi-square tests comparing differences in endorsement of specific consequences for cannabis among those who restricted food on a cannabis use day in the past month versus those who did not. Here's how we obtained our analytic sample. So first, we asked participants if they used alcohol and or cannabis in the last year, to which they responded yes or no. And then to assess their food restriction, we asked them, consider the past year. How often did you restrict food, fat, or calories on a given day? By restricting food, we mean eating less than you normally would, skipping a meal, avoiding certain types of food, or avoiding eating even if hungry, from which they responded 1, never, to 5, very often. If they used a substance in the past year and restricted food more than never in the past year, they were shown this prompt. Consider the past year. How often did you restrict food, fat, or calories on a day you used a given substance, whether that was alcohol or cannabis? They responded from 1, never, to 5, very often, and we ran separate models for alcohol and cannabis use. We repeated this process for past month substance use and food restriction, but participants indicated on a scale from 0 to 30 how many days in the past month they used a substance and restricted food. If they provided non-zero answers for both of these questions, they were provided with this prompt. You indicated that within the last year, you've restricted food, fat, or calories on days you used an indicated substance. Of the number of days that you used that substance in the past 30 days, on how many of those days did you restrict food, fat, or calories, from which they responded from 0 to 30. We used this information to split the sample into past year and month users of alcohol and cannabis, as well as those who restricted food on a substance use day versus those who did not. We assessed alcohol use disorder symptoms, past year alcohol use disorder symptoms with the alcohol use disorder identification test or audit, sum scores, and past 6-month cannabis use disorder symptoms with the cannabis use disorder identification test revised or cut it, or sum scores with higher scores indicating greater hazardous use or substance use disorder symptoms. To assess past month alcohol use consequences, we use the Brief Young Adult Alcohol Consequences Questionnaire, or BACSM scores, and for cannabis, we use the Brief Young Adult Marijuana Consequences Questionnaire, or BMACSM scores, again with greater scores indicating higher substance use consequences, and then we assess specific endorsement of consequences on the BMAC among those who restricted on a cannabis use day versus those who did not in the past month. Here's a visual representation of substance use and food restriction in the sample from the past year. I'm going to take this opportunity to use the laser pointer. Oh no. This one or this one? Ah, awesome. Okay, so here you can see in the past year about 81% of our sample used alcohol, and then in the dark pink here, about 32% of those who used alcohol in the past year restricted food on alcohol use day. In the dark green here, about 68% of our sample used cannabis, and again, in the dark pink, about 21% restricted food on a cannabis use day in the past year. Here's a visual representation of use and restriction in the past month. As you can see, again, in the dark blue, about 91% of our sample who used alcohol in the past year continued to do so in the past month, and about 28% of those who used alcohol continued to restrict food. About 81% of our sample continued to use cannabis in the past month, and among those individuals, about 19% continued to restrict food. Here you can see the results of our t-test comparing mean substance use disorder symptoms between those who did versus did not restrict food on a substance use day in the past year. On the left, you can see that those who restricted food on an alcohol use day in the past year reported significantly more past year alcohol use consequences when compared to those who did not restrict food. And then on the right, we found similar results for cannabis. Those who restricted food on a cannabis use day in the past year reported significantly more past 6-month cannabis use consequences when compared to those who did not restrict food. And then here are the results of our past month comparisons of individuals who restricted food on a substance use day versus those who did not. So you can see that on the left, those who restricted food on an alcohol use day in the past month did not experience a difference in consequences when compared to those who did restrict food on an alcohol use day. And then on the right, however, you can see that those who restricted food on a cannabis use day reported significantly more consequences than those who did not restrict food. We also found that those who restricted food on a cannabis use day in the last month were more likely to endorse 18 of the total 21 consequences on the BMAC, and this list includes risky behavior, dependent symptoms, and social and academic consequences. For example, I have driven a car when I was high. The proportion of individuals who who endorsed this consequence, who restricted food on a substance or on a cannabis use day, was double that of individuals who didn't restrict their food. So this study gave us insight into food restriction on substance use days beyond alcohol use, and we found that in the sample, those who restricted food on alcohol use days didn't endorse more use consequences than those who didn't restrict, but this might just be a result of general alcohol use in the sample. Because this is just a preliminary investigation, we have to look further at more nuanced aspects of substance use, for example, frequency and quantity of use. However, we did find that around 20% of our sample engaged in intentional food restriction on cannabis days in the last year and month, and they endorsed greater cannabis use consequences and disorder symptoms when compared to those who didn't restrict their food. And now that we know this behavior is happening, we can assess motivations for restriction, the order in which people restrict and use substances, specific use expectations when restricting, and more, and we can use that information to develop interventions and feasible protective behavioral strategies for those who use cannabis at a high level and restrict their food. I'd like to thank my mentors and peers of Pearl, Eric, Megan, and Keegan, Dr. Stuart Murray and Mark Prince, Denise for the pep talk on the way over here, IAS at USC for hosting ECAS and allowing me to present this work, and the CSU Psych Department for letting us use their subject pool. Thank you.